Behind the crimson walls of the Forbidden City, cloaked in silk and secrecy, one woman rewrote the fate of an empire. She never wore the imperial crown, never led armies into battle, yet she held the dragon throne in an iron grip for nearly 5 decades. Her enemies feared her, her allies obeyed her. Her name, Empress Dowager Cixi. She rose from concubine to become the most powerful woman in Chinese history. But how did a low-ranking court woman outwit emperors, crush reformers, and leave behind a legacy as mysterious as it is terrifying? Was she a brilliant strategist preserving a crumbling dynasty, or a tyrant whose thirst for power led China to its knees? Whispers of suspicious deaths, poisoned tea, secret lovers, and a hidden prison inside the Forbidden City still haunt the pages of history. And as we dig deeper, one thing becomes chillingly clear. Cixi didn't just rule an empire. She buried its future with her own hands. Are you ready to uncover the deadly legacy of the Dragon Empress? In the year 1851, behind the golden doors of the Forbidden City, a 16-year-old girl was chosen, not for greatness, but for beauty. Her name was Yehanara, a girl of noble Manchu birth. She entered the imperial court as just one among hundreds of concubines, each hoping to catch the eye of the Jianfeng emperor. But unlike the others, Yehanara didn't rely on mere charm. She was watching, listening, calculating. While others vied for favor with soft smiles and silken robes, she studied the emperor's moods, read the unspoken language of the eunuchs, and memorized the shifting alliances of the court. It wasn't long before she became concubine Yi, and soon after the only woman to bear the emperor a son. In a palace where sons meant power, she had struck gold. But even with the emperor's attention, the road to power was steep and lined with shadows. Enemies whispered behind fans. Poison flowed as easily as wine, and every smile from a rival concubine might mask a dagger. Yet concubine Yi thrived in this treacherous world. She didn't merely survive. She manipulated the tides of the court with invisible strings. When the emperor grew weak and the empire trembled under foreign pressure, she made her move, not with violence, but with silence, strategy, and an unrelenting will to dominate. No one saw it coming, not the emperor, not the empress, not even the ministers of state. From the shadows of the harem, a queen was rising. But what price would China pay for her ascent? When the Jianfeng emperor died in 1861, the Forbidden City fell into a hush laced with fear. The empire was cracking. Foreign powers carved away China's dignity with every treaty. Rebels swarmed across provinces. And now, the dragon throne stood without a voice, except for a child. The new emperor, Zaichun, was just 5 years old, too small to wield power, too innocent to sense the vipers circling the court. The reins of the Qing dynasty were slipping fast, but someone was waiting in the wings, watching, ready. Concubine Yi, now Empress Dowager Cixi, stepped forward, but not alone. She forged a secret alliance with the senior empress Qian and the brilliant Prince Gong. Together, they orchestrated a coup so silent, so clean, that the empire didn't realize it had just changed hands until it was too late. The 3 regents appointed by the late emperor, trusted officials meant to guide the child ruler, were arrested without a single sword drawn. In the dead of night, imperial guards surrounded their homes. Accusations were whispered, orders signed, and by sunrise the would-be power brokers were stripped of their rank, exiled, or executed. No blood spilled on the palace floors. No war drums sounded in the streets. Yet a revolution had occurred. A revolution led by a woman who was supposed to be silent and obedient. Cixi now stood at the heart of the empire, cloaked in silk and shadow, her voice calm but unyielding. She was no longer just a mother to the emperor. She was the empire's hidden hand, the quiet storm behind the curtain. But whispers grew louder in the court halls. How had a concubine outplayed China's most powerful men? What was she willing to do to keep her grip on the throne? And had the Qing dynasty been saved, or sealed in a gilded coffin? With the child emperor nestled like a puppet on the throne, Cixi began to weave. But this was no ordinary rule. It was a reign spun in whispers, stitched in secrets, and reinforced with fear. Cixi didn't wield power openly. She cloaked it in silence, manipulating ministers, generals, and princes as if she were playing an endless game of chess with the empire itself as the board. She watched the court like a hawk, rewards for loyalty, exile for betrayal. Courtiers who crossed her path mysteriously retired early, or vanished altogether. Her eyes and ears were everywhere. Eunuchs, servants, even family members turned informants. No conversation was safe. No alliance was sacred. The Forbidden City had become her spider's web, and no one could escape its strands. But she didn't stop at politics. Cixi mastered the art of perception. Behind flowing robes and delicate fans, she crafted an image of the devoted mother, the grieving widow, the reluctant ruler. The world saw humility, but beneath the silk and powdered face was a mind sharper than any sword. Foreign envoys underestimated her. Reformers feared her. Revolutionaries loathed her. And yet, she endured. But something darker crept beneath her carefully curated rule. Reformists began to die under suspicious circumstances. Progressive advisors were silenced. Ancient rituals were revived with renewed intensity. Was it tradition or control? As her network grew tighter, the empire grew weaker. The dragon still flew above the palace, but its wings had grown heavy. And through it all, Cixi sat behind a curtain, her eyes fixed on the empire she refused to surrender. How long could she maintain this illusion of stability? What price was China paying for her grip on power? And when the web finally snapped, who would fall and who would survive? He was born into power, but raised in a prison of velvet and silence. Emperor Tongji, son of Cixi, was the light of a crumbling dynasty, the child monarch everyone pinned their last hopes on. But from the moment he learned to speak, he realized the throne beneath him was just for show. The real ruler sat behind a silk screen, watching, listening, deciding. His mother. As he grew, so did the walls around him. Every tutor, every servant, every decree, chosen by Cixi. Even his closest allies were shadows of her will. Tongji, though an emperor in name, was little more than a marionette, tugged by the strings of a woman whose love was laced with control. By his teenage years, the young emperor began to rebel. He sought independence, freedom from the suffocating grasp of the Dowager Empress. He wanted to rule his way. He turned to pleasure, to defiance, to escape, drinking, gambling, sneaking out of the Forbidden City in disguise. Some said he found comfort in brothels. Others whispered of secret plots to wrest power from his mother. Then came the scandal. Tongji fell ill, gravely. The court claimed it was smallpox. But behind closed doors, darker rumors festered. Some believed it was syphilis, contracted during his secret outings. Others whispered of poison, a quiet silencing of a son who had grown too bold. At just 18 years old, the son of heaven, an emperor born to restore glory, was dead. No great mourning echoed through the palace. No dynasty-shaking investigation followed. Instead, Cixi moved quickly, placing her adopted nephew on the throne, a child she could mold once more. Her reign continued, unchallenged, uninterrupted. But the echoes of Tongji's tragedy never faded. Did he truly die from disease, or was he a casualty of a mother's ambition? Was his fall the result of his own rebellion, or the final act of a bloodless purge? And in the silence that followed his death, did Cixi weep, or simply tighten her grip? For a brief moment, the empire breathed. In 1898, a young emperor, Guangxu, Cixi's hand-picked successor, dared to dream. Surrounded by visionaries and reformers, he launched the 100 Days of Reform, a whirlwind effort to drag China into the modern age. New schools, Western science, a modern military. The empire, long cloaked in ritual and rot, began to stir. It was bold, it was dangerous, and it was done without Cixi's blessing. The Empress Dowager watched in silence, but behind her calm gaze, storm clouds were gathering. She had seen emperors rise before, naive, idealistic, hungry for power, and she had ended them. Within the palace, shadows began to move. Spies posed as servants, listening at every door. Reformist ministers were followed. Rumors swirled that foreign advisors would soon be placed above Manchu princes. To Cixi, the 100 Days wasn't just reform. It was a coup in disguise. Then, the hammer fell. On the 103rd day, the Forbidden City was stormed, not by an army, but by Cixi's iron will. She emerged from retirement like a dragon awakened. The Guangxu emperor, once full of hope, was dragged from his throne and placed under house arrest in his own palace, never to rule again. One by one, the reformers were hunted down. 6 of them were executed, their heads displayed as a warning to any who dared challenge the old order. One man, Kang Yue, barely escaped with his life, fleeing in disguise across mountains and oceans. Cixi reinstalled herself at the helm, cloaked not in humility, but in steel. Reform was dead. The empire's last chance to rise had been strangled in its cradle. But even as she reclaimed power, a dangerous new energy was beginning to churn. The people were restless. Foreign powers loomed larger. Revolution was no longer a whisper. It was a drumbeat, growing louder. Had Cixi saved the Qing, or doomed it? And as the Guangxu emperor sat behind palace walls, under lock and key, he asked himself the question no one dared speak aloud. Was she his protector, or his executioner? The empire was burning, and in its ashes the shadows of desperation rose. At the dawn of the 20th century, foreign powers carved China apart like a dying beast. Railroads split sacred lands. Missionaries challenged ancient beliefs. Foreign soldiers patrolled imperial streets. The humiliation was unbearable. Then, from the dust and rage came the Boxers. Fierce, fanatical warriors who believed they could stop bullets with their fists and call upon the spirits of the old world. They chanted, they fought, they killed. Their message was clear. Death to the foreigners. Death to those who side with them. And Cixi listened. For years, she had played a delicate game, appeasing foreign nations on the surface while crushing internal dissent with quiet efficiency. But now, the tide had shifted. She saw in the Boxers something terrifying and tempting. A final chance to reclaim China's soul. One last roll of the dice. In June 1900, she made her fateful choice. The Qing court threw its support behind the Boxers. Imperial edicts were issued. Foreign legations in Beijing were besieged. Diplomats, missionaries, and innocent civilians were slaughtered in the streets. The world erupted in fury. 8 foreign powers, nations that had once bickered among themselves, now stood united. Their armies marched on Beijing with relentless precision. The Forbidden City trembled. Cixi fled the capital in disguise, dressed as a humble peasant, carried in a cart pulled by oxen. Her empire, once adorned in gold and power, now lay in ruins. She watched the city vanish behind her, smoke rising into the sky like a funeral pyre for the dynasty she had ruled with an iron hand. The Boxers were crushed. Beijing was occupied, and China was forced to pay a staggering indemnity. But even in exile, Cixi was not yet done. She returned 2 years later, battered but unbroken. In a stunning reversal, she embraced the very reforms she once crushed, abolishing the imperial exam, modernizing education, and laying groundwork for a constitutional monarchy. But for many, it was too little, too late. The empire had been fatally wounded. Behind closed doors, the Guangxu emperor, her puppet turned prisoner, sickened and died under mysterious circumstances, just 1 day before Cixi herself passed away. Some believe it was poison. A final silencing. A last effort to ensure that no one could unravel the web of control she had spun so meticulously for nearly 5 decades. When Cixi died in 1908, she left behind a crumbling empire and a legacy soaked in silk and blood. Within 4 years, the Qing dynasty would collapse, the dragon throne shattered, the imperial era dead. But whispers remained. Had Cixi been China's last defender, or its greatest betrayer? Did she fight for her people, or merely for power? And in the end, did she shape history, or seal its fate? The Forbidden City had never been so silent. In the autumn of 1908, two deaths sent tremors through the heart of China. First, the Guangxu emperor, long imprisoned by the very woman who once crowned him, died suddenly, his face pale, his lips darkened. A quiet rumor slithered through palace halls. Arsenic. A final, silent command to ensure he would never rule after her. And then, barely a day later, Cixi was dead. The woman who had ruled China from behind a silk screen for nearly 5 decades, the Empress Dowager who pulled puppet strings while emperors withered, was gone. But her shadow remained long and cold. Her funeral was a spectacle of imperial grandeur. Golden coffins, rivers of silk, thousands of mourners. Yet behind the ceremony, the empire trembled. The dragon throne she fought so hard to preserve now sat beneath a boy barely 3 years old, Puyi, the last emperor of China. The final chapter of the Qing dynasty had begun. Outside the palace walls, revolution gathered like a storm. In just 4 years, the monarchy crumbled, and a republic rose from the rubble. For the first time in over 2,000 years, China was without an emperor. But even as the dust settled, one name continued to haunt the history books. Cixi. Was she the brilliant tactician who delayed the dynasty's fall? Or the power-hungry tyrant who crushed progress to preserve her throne? Some say she was a master of survival, a woman who ruled in a world meant only for men. Others say she was the architect of the Qing's downfall, her ambition drowning an empire in blood and betrayal. In life, she commanded empires. In death, she commands questions. And somewhere, deep within the Forbidden City, where crimson walls echo forgotten footsteps, her legacy lingers, a ghost draped in silk and secrets. She never wore the imperial crown. She never officially ruled as emperor. Yet, for nearly half a century, China bowed to her will. Empress Dowager Cixi, once a low-ranking concubine, rose from the shadows of the harem to become the most powerful woman in the history of imperial China. Her reign was a labyrinth of manipulation, fear, loyalty, betrayal, and raw, unyielding ambition. She silenced emperors, she crushed reformers, she tamed a fractured empire, only to rule it with an iron hand wrapped in embroidered silk. But history has never decided what to make of her. To some, she was a villain, a selfish despot who stalled China's modernization, who protected her power while her people suffered. A woman who poisoned progress, stifled change, and left her nation bleeding in the claws of foreign invaders. To others, she was a survivor in a brutal system, a woman who outwitted court rivals, foreign powers, and palace conspiracies in a world dominated by men. A master of adaptation who preserved the throne through turbulent storms, only to be undone by the tides of revolution. She remains one of history's most polarizing figures, a monarch without a crown, a ruler without a title, a dragon cloaked in mystery. And today, more than a century later, the shadow of Cixi still stirs debate. Was she the savior of a dying dynasty, or its final executioner? As the dust of time settles, one truth remains. The story of the Dragon Empress is far from over. It lives on, in the palaces she once haunted, in the bloodlines of those she ruled, and in the questions we still ask when we dare to look behind the curtain of power.